as John said, I am a director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West, and we do many things with the Pre-Corps, including some of you probably know, we work with Sally Benson on providing these internships to Sacramento and the Weeb and the WEC, and offering a class on energy policy in California. But this is research that we've been doing related to the question of the difficulty of siting wind energy. So if we look at the very ambitious goals that California has in terms of moving forward with replacing fossil fuels with wind and solar and other forms of cleaner energy, one of the real obstacles, particularly for wind, is the siting problem. That is to say, people not wanting to have utility scale wind facilities near their homes, not near places where there's lots of wildlife, et cetera. And so in recent years, Texas and Oklahoma, which have a lot of land, a lot of wind, and have built transmission facilities, are now far exceeding California in terms of the amount of installed wind energy. So I went to, a couple years ago when John DeBerry first got to campus here, he gave an introduction to his work on vertical wind turbines and the potential for greater efficiency by the optimal placement of this based on his work on fluid dynamics. And I thought it was quite interesting because he made two claims in that talk that I thought were testable. One was that because these turbines were smaller and their footprint seemed to him to be less intrusive, that people were more acceptant of wind turbines. So we thought, well, that's testable. Let's see if that's true. And then the other thing he claimed is that because they were smaller, lower to the ground, they didn't have the sort of massive radius of the horizontal turbines, that they would be less dangerous to the birds, which is a major problem, particularly in California, in terms of the siting, because we happen to be in the pathway for a lot of wildlife that comes through. So this seemed to be something that we could work with John on. So fortunately, he's only 2 doors down from where I am, and so it speaks also to the value of proximity of having social scientists and natural scientists in the same place, because we thought, well, look, he really was quite frustrated by his inability to even get a test site in California to sort of test hypotheses about the vertical wind turbine. So we thought, well, okay, let's go ahead and do something about this. And this is when you think about policy, that step one of policy is going out and actually getting the legislation, as we've done with AB 32 and various other pieces of legislation in California. But the other piece of it is actually implementing that, and actually being able to put the transmission lines in, actually being able to implement utility scale solar and wind. And this is hard in states where the permitting processes are complex, in which there are many different agencies you have to deal with, and in which the citizen groups are quite vocal. And so our attempt, and you'll see with Iris when she explains our research design, our attempt is to distinguish the different elements of the public. We think of public opinion not just as sort of the average person, but also in terms of activism, and also in terms of their actual involvement with organizations such as the wildlife organizations, because they end up being the players that show up at the hearings. They're the ones that can use the processes to slow things down or actually prohibit the development of wind. So you'll see in our study that we're sensitive to that, and that one other thing I will say is that John suggested we were only going to give you stuff about the West, the American West. In reality, as a special bonus, we're also going to talk about China, because we've done work in China as well. So with that, I want to hand it over. We turn from the old and decrepit to the young and vigorous. We'll hand it over to Iris, who will explain what our work, how it was set up, and what results we found.
I have the mic. Yep. Is it on? Yes. Okay. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. So before I start, I want to kind of give you a disclaimer. I am a political scientist, so is Bruce. So we are social scientists. So if you are interested in anything about electricity, or about the energy, or the the engineering of the vertical wind turbine, feel free to email John DeBerry. So we are here to answer questions about people. So what do we do, social scientists? What we do mostly is to seek understanding of hows and whys of human behavior. Now, there are a lot of crossover between social science and engineering. Now, so the idea of crossover is that we can take some aspects of each discipline and then combine them into something more and something bigger, something different. Now, so there are many interesting questions that we related to human beings' behavior and knowledge. So for example, you think about scientific communication. So when an engineer has a new idea or has a new product that wants to introduce to the market, how do people react to it? How are we going to communicate the new idea, the technology to people? And also another thing is how do we convince people to accept something new? Especially we know that in social science, once people have established an idea, the idea stays in their head. It's very hard to change. So how do we change people's mind? And then we also talk about a lot of in our research work, how do we use scientific knowledge to affect the decision-making process, especially among the policy makers? And how do people apply the knowledge when they make decisions? Now, so as Bruce mentioned, we met John DeBerry, who is just across from the hallway, from my office, and he was working on this vertical wind turbine. Now, so what's the difference between a vertical and horizontal wind turbine? Now, as you see, the vertical wind turbine on this side and the horizontal wind turbine on that side. So the horizontal wind turbine is a set of blades that rotate around a horizontal axis, like a propeller. And for the vertical design, for example, this is John's system. So the blade rotates around the ground, perpendicular to the ground. And the development of the the vertical wind turbine has been lagging behind the horizontal wind turbine. But then there are recent resurgence in interest because there are new research coming up, especially by John DeBerry and his groups and colleagues, that look at the aerodynamics that could be created by placing all the turbines together in a very tight space. So each turbine, so if we think about each horizontal turbine, each one generates about 2 to 3 megawatts individually. But then for the vertical turbine, yes, each one generates less energy. But then when you have a system of vertical wind turbines together, the aerodynamics can compensate the loss of height deficiency, and that can increase the turbine efficiency. And then at the same time, there is another advantage of the vertical wind turbine. The start wind speed is lower than that of the horizontal wind turbine. Now, and then there are other advantages of vertical wind turbines. So one thing we learned from John is that it can turn to the wind direction much more efficiently. And so it can be used in some kind of very urban setting where the wind turbine is close to built environment. And then it also facilitates the installation because the wind turbine, as you will see, is actually pretty close to the ground. It's much smaller in size. And so because they're closer to ground, so in terms of maintenance and operation, the cost we expect will be lower. Now, so the research question that we are interested in is, a couple of them. Well, we have a couple of them. So how do people receive this, vertical wind turbines idea? Because most of them, we asked in the survey, have you come across vertical wind turbine? And most of the answer is no, they have not seen it or heard of it before. So how do people receive the new ideas? Now, and also, does the way we communicate to them, the way we introduce the concept to them, make a difference at all here? Well, after we introduce the concept to them, so how does their first impression compare to the vertical wind, the horizontal wind turbine? So what are some of the features that people like about vertical wind turbine? Some of the features that people don't like about it? And in terms of siting, like Bruce mentioned, so where are the preferred locations? Now, the wind turbine, the vertical wind turbine, that John developed, has an advantage because it's smaller and it could be potentially installed in urban area. So one thing we want to know is whether people actually support having wind turbine in urban areas. Now, so altogether, we did 3 studies. So 2 were in energy policy, and one hopefully will be in Wind Energy Journal. So one was in China, One was done in China, and then the other two are done in California. So what we do, kind of like, very quick comparison. You may be thinking about like, we may be doing some kind of like focus group. The answer is no, we are not doing focus group. We are doing very large N study. What we do is like, works that requires a lot of statistics and a lot of assumptions about sampling. And the goal is to draw some quote-unquote representative sample. Now, I'll come back to this term a little bit. From the population of interest. And then we want to identify the common patterns in human behaviors and thinking patterns. Not only like, just like common behaviors within California population, but then common behaviors, among mankind. So we have 3 studies. So these 3 studies actually have covered 3 separate populations. So the first population of interest is California, because we're Center for the West, partly, and also because green energy is very important in California. So we have the adult population in California, that is our target population of interest. And then we drew a sample of 2,000 respondents. Now, so these are opt-in survey. What we are going to talk about is like, we did an online opt-in survey. People voluntarily sign in, and then they answer the survey. But then you will ask me like, okay, so then, how do you, make sure that the representative list of the sample? I'm going to talk about it. First of all, what we did was we did quota sampling in California. So we, based on age, based on sex, based on ethnicity, and based on the residency in California or not. So we drew a sample that closely resembled, these dimensions in the census characteristics. So this is a kind of like a distribution of how much it takes them to finish a survey. Now you see that there are people who finish like within like 5 minutes. So, you kind of like, be a little bit skeptical because the survey we expect to take about at least like 10 to 15 minutes. So these are probably people who kind of like, just rush through the results very quickly without really much thinking. And we don't want them to be in the sample. So what we end up doing is we cut off people who finish the survey too fast. And then we also did what we call as the quality control. We did what we call as an attention check in the survey. So embedded in the survey are a couple of questions. Think of them as kind of like, some kind of like, hoops that they have jumped through in order to be in the sample. So we asked them, like, are you going to commit thoughtfully to answer, the questions in the survey? And then they have to say, yes, I have to, I will provide my best answers. They have to say that. If they don't say that, then they're out, okay? So, and then another thing that this is like really a trick. It is like embedded right in the middle of the survey. So there is a question. So we would like to ensure respondents are paying attention to the questions. To demonstrate that you are carefully reading, please select the answer other below and type the word survey in the text box. Thank you. So you have no idea how many people fail it. So we sample, I think we probably have recruited maybe like over 3,000 samples, and then we ended up with 2,000. So, that it kind of like it tells you how many people failed that test. So people who retain in our sample are people who at least, pass the quality test, and then people who also kind of like fulfill our quota, our socio-demographic quota. Now, the second part, second population of interest that we are interested in is the online activist. So like Bruce said, like the permitting process, a lot of people who actually are vocal, they are the local activists. They are maybe opinion leaders in the communities. So we really care about their opinions. And we want to know whether the opinions actually diverge from that of the general public. So what we did, unfortunately, there is no simple way to sample activists online. So what we do is another like opt-in sample, an opt-in study with a sample size of about 100 activists. So we had an RA who really worked very hard to contact different wind energy groups in California. So we have a sample of some of them here, and then the LA approach each of them and say, can you share our survey on your email list with your clients or with your participants, and then and through that kind of a slow boiling sample, we got 100 respondents. So one thing that we are interested in, kind of like thinking about, these population is how active they are politically and environmentally. So one thing that we did is to ask them 2 batteries of questions. We asked them in random order whether they communicate with their friends about protecting the environment, whether they buy organic food, whether they buy local grown food, whether they recycle papers or not. So these are some of the green behaviors that they could be doing. And then we also asked some questions about political participation, like whether the green behavior translate into any kind of political action at all. So altogether, we have like 6 additional items that ask them whether they contact local government officials, whether they contribute monies, whether they contact public officials about environmental issues. So altogether, there are 14 items. So 8 items here, 6 items here. So we add them all up, and then we call something, this is what we call as like an activism score. So this is kind of like just a distribution of the activism score in the population and in our activist sample. So you notice that the white area is the distribution, the frequency distribution for our general population. So the mean is about 5, whereas for our activist sample, the one in red, the mean is about 10. So the other way is put it is kind of like, hey, we have done pretty well with our activist sample. It has at least passed the face validity. So this is kind of like a very long table, comparing our population with the general population in California. The one thing that jumps out is our populations tend to be more educated, tend to have more white respondents and fewer Latino respondents. And this will come back again with the China sample. Now, so the first thing that we are interested in, because we have a graduate student at that time who is now a faculty at University of Virginia, she is interested in like taking the survey to China. And then I said, and then we said, well, that's a great idea. So we are particularly interested in how urban residents in China think about vertical wind turbine. Now, because as you know, that China is probably one of the most, if not the most, polluted country in the world. So we want to know, like, how people react to some kind of like, new green technology. So we did a sample, we did a survey in China. It's done in Chinese, of course. So the sample size is about 1,000 respondents. Okay, so you look at the sample in China, you see again, like, 70% of people have bachelor degree, which is like way higher than the general population. So we are not saying that, this population represents the general population in China, but then, do some, there is, some caveat that you have to pay attention, especially when you interpret the results. Okay, so any question before I move forward? So one thing we are interested in is like, how people react when we ask them about the wind turbine. So we start off with questions like this. We ask them, first of all, about the general conventional wind turbine. And then we introduce the concept to them using 3 different kinds of communication methods. And then we ask them questions about the new vertical wind turbines. And then we also introduce some new concepts to them about the characteristics of the wind turbine. And then at the end, we have some questions that ask them to leave some qualitative comments about what they think about the wind turbine. Okay, so this is where we start off. So you all have seen the conventional wind turbine system. So we have 3 locations. The first location is kind of like an open space location. Second location is an ocean, And then the third location in the bottom, this is kind of like a rural location. So we asked on a scale of 0 to 10, how desirable do you think these horizontal wind turbines are? And people say 5 if they kind of think it's in the middle, 10 if they really, really love it. Now, so at the beginning, we asked this question, like whether the communication method, the way we introduce the concept to the people, matter at all. And the answer is no. What is interesting is we actually varied like 3 types of treatment to the respondents. So in our first group, we gave them this photo, this picture. So this focused on the size of the wind turbine. So you can see that the size of the wind turbine is like 1/10 of the conventional wind turbine system. And then another treatment that we give is to say, okay, instead of looking at a picture, why don't we show them a video? So we show them a video of how the vertical wind turbine actually functions, how it rotates. So this is a simulation. And then lastly, we show them actual footage of how it actually functioned in one of John's experimental sites. So what's interesting is that we noticed that the communication method, it doesn't matter whether we show them a picture or videos, pretty much we come to the same conclusion. So in this particular case, we were surprised to find that there is no effect with communication strategies. Now, so then we show them like a couple of same questions, a couple of the same pictures, but then this time instead of like having the big, gigantic, horizontal wind turbine, we have the small vertical wind turbines in the system. So exactly the same location, we ask, how do you think about the desirability of this wind turbine location? So these are kind of like the distribution of the scores. So like I said, 0 is something like, if they really hate it, 10 if they really, really like it. Now, and then we do a comparison, a pairwise comparison. So we have the conventional ocean and the vertical ocean. So this is kind of like looking at the first picture and then compare the scores for the conventional wind turbine system with the score of the vertical wind system. Now, pretty much, you can see that like, the median, the white dots, they are very comparable, right? So, look at this first pair comparison. The white dots are kind of like, almost, very close, I would say. And then, you have the same pattern here, and then you have the same pattern here, okay? So for the California general public, their top preference is to have it in open space, and then the last preference is to have it in ocean setting, okay? So let's compare that with Chinese residents. Like these urban residents in China actually have pretty different ideas or different initial impression about the vertical wind turbines. So if we compare again, the three pairs. Now you can see that the first one is the conventional wind turbine. First one is the conventional wind turbine, and this one is the conventional wind turbine in the in the open space setting. The median are consistently higher than that for the vertical wind turbines. So in the Chinese population, so pretty much, it's the reverse pattern. So they actually like it in ocean, and they don't prefer it in a rural area. So we have a pretty, different results, here. So with the California sample, we can kind of like ask, so what does actually the underlying distribution looks like, for the type of activists or the types of like supporters that we have? Now, so this is kind of like, very, how would I put it? There's a complex methodology behind it. So I'm not going to go into that. But so pretty much, the idea is if you look at the general population sample and our online activist sample, you pretty much, come to the same story. So there are people, the group 1, who support vertical wind turbine only. And then there are people, group 4, who support the horizontal wind turbine only. That group is like much bigger than the first group. And then you have like group 2, which is the largest group. So these are the people who support wind turbines, period. Whether you introduce the horizontal or the vertical wind turbines to them, they equally like it. And then you have group 3. These are the opponents, interesting enough. 35% of people who actually don't want wind turbines, period. So we ask, one advantage of the wind turbine, the vertical wind turbine system is that it's compact enough, so it could be integrated in urban areas. So the idea is that, perhaps they could be put along a highway, or maybe in an urban center like this here, or maybe kind of like along a shoreline, in the urban area. So we have these 3 pictures, and then we ask people, how do you think of them? To our surprise, and kind of like to everybody's surprise, the urban location, the last 2, were the least preferred. We were hoping that there would be more support in the urban area. But then this is California sample. So Californians still want their wind turbine, regardless of whether it's vertical, horizontal, they still want it in the open space. And they don't really want them in the urban area. So that's resistance is pretty strong. Whereas in China, the white dots are pretty much on the same line, right? So pretty much, the story is that, they are indifferent to the location for Chinese living in urban China. Now, so another way we can kind of like, compare the general public with the activists is to look at, their preference for location. So you see that on this side of the graph, the average desirability score is around 7, and it's pretty much, the same regardless of location. So that means that for the California activist, they don't really care location. Who cares the most are the people who are the least politically active and environmentally active. They don't want the system to be in urban areas. Now, so we talk about, the location. Another features that we are interested in are the kind of like, the pros and cons of the system. Are there like special features that people like? Are there features that people like totally dislike? So we gave them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different options. So each time we randomly assign 3 different statements to people. So there are different permutations of, like characteristics. So what we ended up finding is the kind of like the pros and cons. Now this is a kind of like complicated graph, so let me walk you through. So on the right side, on the right side or left side? Left side. Like when the quality is not mentioned. So for example, like the first one, when we say, the wind turbine system is shorter, then, when we mention that, the support went from 65% to 70%. And then for the second quality, whether it killed fewer birds or not, the support went from 60% when it is not mentioned to almost 75% when it's mentioned. So that is like a jump of like 15 percentage point. And similarly, we can see the same pattern here. So the top 3, plus this one, the bottom one, easy installation. So these are kind of like considered as like, the pros of the vertical wind turbine system. And among these 4 characteristics, the number one that is most important to them is actually killing fewer birds. So for California general public, the most that they care about, or the biggest advantage of the vertical wind turbine system is that they potentially could kill fewer birds and bats. So that is like, what's important to the California general public. This is kind of like, comparison of the same graph, but this one is divided by the population activism. Less interesting, but this one is more interesting. This one is actually looking at the online activist. So you see that the slopes are relatively gentler. So they are, kind of like, less steep. Another way to put it is that, the ideas, the kind of like, they already have like, pre-existing ideas in their head. So when you introduce new concepts or new ideas to them, they are less resistant to change. They're more resistant to change, sorry. But then, for the killing birds, this one, the advantage remains. So, if it is mentioned, that will induce almost like a 15 percentage point increase in the popularity of the vertical system. So California really cares about birds. So, if you can convince people that the vertical wind turbine system could potentially kill fewer birds, that could be a major selling point, for the policymakers. Now, China residents are kind of like interesting in another way. What's the most important thing to them is not really the wildlife. Guess what it is? The noise. So to them, the noise level is actually the most important aspect of the vertical wind turbine system. So if the noise, is actually, more quiet, then, we see a support increases from almost like 0.75 to almost like, 0.9. So we see the biggest support, increase when we tell them that the wind turbine system is more quiet than the conventional wind turbine system. How about when it comes to price sensitivity, like the price elasticity? So one thing we notice is that everybody hates paying more. So this is kind of like a universal human being behavior. And then, you see the sharpest drop-off, especially in the first group. These are the people who are less attended to politics, who are less politically active. And then you see the support, like if we started out with the same price, the support for vertical wind turbine is about 60%. And then if you say like, well, how about like if we increase the price per month for $5, the support dropped down to 40%. And then if the price, go up by $25 per month, then the support is kind of like, close to, 5%. Okay, so people don't like to pay more for the technology. And you see pretty much, the same thing, but just kind of like less intense in the pattern when we look at this online activists in California. Now, the China sample, we do see the same pattern. When we ask people, if it stay the same, you have 60% who say strongly support the system. But then when the bill goes up by 25 RMB, then it goes down, the support goes down. 25 RMB is roughly equivalent to like $3 US. So, on this, we're not comparing apples to apples because the cost of living is much lower in China. Distant from home. So, this is what we know as NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. And pretty much we see that, pretty strongly in the general population sample. So people go, if you tell them like, if there is a wind turbine farm, going to be installed 5 miles, 10 miles, 25 miles, or 50 miles from your home, which one would you support? And then the support, of course, increases when it is further away from one's residence. But what is interesting, if you actually compare the two graphs, is that if you look at the other side, the knowledge, the community online activist side, there is also like kind of like no preference. The green colors are almost identical in height. So that means like they are less sensitive to where the location of the wind farms are. China urban residents, same universal human behaviors. Away from my home, as far as possible. And if they're further away, so if they're like 25 to 50 km away, then they actually think the support will actually go up to like almost like 50%. We also ask about alternative energy source. So which is actually the preferred energy source for the respondents, and whether it's in China or in California. The number one choice is solar energy, followed by the wind energy. Whether it's vertical or horizontal, they like it, pretty much the same. And then the least preferred ones are the fossil fuel and the nuclear power. So this is pretty consistent, in China as well. At the end of the survey, we asked people to kind of like, give us some comments about, the vertical wind turbines. We hand-coded it with, just kind of like, like hard, like difficult, hard-working research assistants. So, pretty much, there are, a lot of very mixed comments. So a lot of comments, kind of like, touch on the cost component. So they like the vertical wind system, but then if it is costly, then they don't like it. And then when it comes to location, that a lot of people mention, they actually, there is kind of like a strong preference for it to be in, desert or some places like further away from urban environments. So a lot of the activists, you can see, percentages of mentioned, goes up. My laser doesn't work anymore, sorry. So you can see on this side, the activists are way more likely to, make comments about, the vertical wind turbine system. And a lot of comments, kind of like focus on A, the visual aspect of the wind turbine system, and B, the safety, whether it can really help to reduce bird kills in the farm area, in the wind farm area. So we see like differences. I have a lot of quotes, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip them. And if you're interested, we can definitely come back in the Q&A session. All right, so just a kind of like quick comparison. So we want to identify commonalities, and then we also want to identify like differences across the three populations. So in our communication method, whether we show them a video, whether we show them a picture, it doesn't seem to matter at all. This is universal in California and also in China. When it comes to the contrast between vertical and horizontal wind turbine, it seems like the Chinese urban residents, they prefer the horizontal wind turbine a little bit more than the vertical wind turbine. And then the online activists are very divided on this particular issue. When it comes to price sensitivity, very strong, in California. Like, no way, I'm going to pay more for the technology. But then the online activists are kind of like, that's okay. We may be able to, support it even if it is like, 10 or 20 bucks more. When it comes to location, we see the same pattern. Pretty much, the urban residents in China and the California sample, they want the wind turbine farm to be like as far away as possible. And then the online activist is kind of like, location less important and less sensitive. So the most preferred location for California general public is open space. But then, the urban residents in China, they don't seem to differentiate, any difference between urban open space, rural, or ocean. What is interesting is that the fewer birds component. So in California, wildlife is really a huge thing, whether it's for activists or for the general public. But then in China, it's actually whether the turbine make a lot of noise or less noise. That is the most important element in their opinions. And then we find, there is, of course, that universal human behavior that nobody wants to pay more. So challenges ahead. What is interesting is that in the California sample, we asked them what percentage of them actually believe global climate change is happening. And even in a green state like California, guess what? 20 to 25% of people actually don't think global climate change is happening or it will happen at all. So we noticed that these climate change denials are people who are like strongly resistant towards the idea of wind turbine, period. So they are not like say I want horizontal versus vertical. They just say no, we don't need wind turbine system, period. Now the challenge is then how do we convince them to change their mind? And then we also notice like NIMBYism and pocketbook consideration. People don't want to pay more. People want it to be far away from their home. How do we convince people when we actually put a farm site in the neighborhood? So one thing we notice is there is no general public. So if we kind of think about people in terms of their environmental activism and in terms of the political activism, so we noticed that the energy activists, they have the strongly held opinions that resist change. And then the least active general public is more susceptible to change, so they are more open to new ideas. However, they are not attuned to politics. They're also not attuned to new information. So these are some of the media coverage of our studies, if you're interested. And then last thing I want to wrap up with just kind of like a quick summary of the kind of projects that we are doing at the Building Center. So we do a lot of public opinion studies, not only in California, but also kind of like US national sample. And then we also have public opinion study in China. So we, in addition to public opinion study, we actually are very interested in the coastal management, wildfire management, climate change, rising sea level, energy use in US and Mexico, and all these different aspects. So we use a lot of computational science methodology in our projects. So we use a lot of web scraping, textual analysis, NLP, natural language processing. And then we also use a lot of data science, like statistics, like public opinion polling, that we rely a lot on statistics. And then we do a lot of things with structured and unstructured data. And we do a lot of experiments as well. So why do I bring that up? Because we are looking for RAs. So if you're interested in any of these projects or any of these technology or methodology, come work for us. We are looking for RAs for the full-time in the summer or part-time in the summer or during the part-time during the regular quarters. And you can see that the RAs are very happy, and they have free food and good food. Yes. So that's the key component. So if you're interested, do come to talk to us or find us at our building center, which is in 174 Y2E2. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Iris and Bruce. I'd actually, at this point, like to introduce for the students registered for the class, Bianca Drought, who's sitting in the back, wave her hand. So she'll be here and taking attendance after the session ends. So as per usual, we'd like to start with student questions. Do we have any student questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Grecia. I'm a student from the Energy Resources Engineering Department. I was wondering if you think it's valuable, would be valuable to see how the participants believe change if you add the option to make money installing these turbines to close their homes, or maybe to reduce the electricity bill or something like that.
Yeah, so it's the opposite. So instead of asking if the system would cost you more, how would you respond to it? We can also, like you said, ask the question differently and say, if the system actually can produce energy and then we can sell it back to the community, and then how would people react to that part? I would actually think no doubt people would actually support the idea, especially if you think about 50% of people who say. If the cost stay the same, they will support the vertical wind turbine. If you say, well, actually, it will reduce your cost per month, or it will do some greater societal goods, people would definitely support that. We believe that.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd say is the interesting piece of that is that with rooftop solar, you're putting it in the urban settings next to people's homes, so there'd be that trade-off between getting some money, but also having a system, even if it was one or two of these things, very close to where people live. So I'm not sure that it's obvious how much the effect would be to get them more money. You might have to pay them more to put up with the discomfort of having it. It's hard to tell. But it's an interesting twist that we could look into. Yeah. So thank you for that.
More student questions, sir?
Yes. You mentioned earlier that when it came to activists, there was activists, and then there was also people who were involved in politics, and that they were both stubborn to change. Which which one of those two would you argue were the most stubborn when it came to getting
Yeah.
any progress? Based off of your data.
Yeah, so the question is, so if we look at like people who are less active in politics, they are actually, more open to changes. But then the problem is they don't pay attention. So they are not receiving information. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have people who are activists, who already have very strong held ideas in their head. And it's very hard to change their mind. Now, so who are more challenging? I think both are very challenging. But then in terms of the sheer size of the population, there are way more people who are least politically active than people who are more politically active. But then people who are more politically active, they are more vocal, and then their voice are much stronger than people who are less politically active.
Yeah. So if we take, for example, the siting and the permitting problem, well, I don't think if you take the siting and the permitting, your average person doesn't show up unless the siting is in their neighborhood. So even though they're less numerous, they're the people that will show up at these permitting hearings and raise objections. And not that the objections are not valid, but they're the ones that will be heard. And the people that are doing the permitting are going to record those objections and then force whatever utility or company that's putting in a facility to actually respond to those. So in terms of their influence on the permitting process, it's not the general public. It would, and one of the problems that we had in our study is that we didn't distinguish between the groups that were very more wildlife oriented. We didn't put ID numbers on that.
Yeah.
And you could have bifurcated the strongly opposed group, and I think we would have found a lot more of their resistance to the wind turbines, not necessarily on partisanship per se, but on their concern about wildlife, and raptors, birds, et cetera. Yeah.
One more student question, maybe.
As far as identifying the activists or the people with a lot of social capital, I know it's kind of a tricky thing to do. It seems like you were going based on, how politically active people have been in their kind of like online presence.
Yeah.
Was there any turmoil or any tough discussion about how to decide whether someone has social capital in their community or not?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a measurement question that we political scientists struggle with. Like, how do we measure, activism? There are so many different dimensions, like political activism, social activism. We try to incorporate all of them in our questions. Like, there are questions like, like whether they talk about environmental issues with their friends. That's so kind of like, that hopefully touch on the social activism part of it. And then there is, questions. There are questions that are about, whether they contact local government officials or not. They are more like the political aspect of it. But, pretty much like, there are so many questions that we can ask, but then there is so limited space. So we only have 10 to 15 minutes before people just give up the survey.
Yeah, and bear in mind, because it went by very quickly, we really had kind of two definitions of activists going on. So in the general survey, we were distinguishing people in terms of their general political activism, but that special subsample was of people who are belonging to organizations that are actively involved either for or against wind energy. And so that's a higher level of social capital invested in this particular issue. And that's where we see it's very hard. Once people get into that level of activism, you're not going to persuade them very easily with information, additional information, because many of them already know it or already have made up their mind. So bear in mind that there are two types of activism in that study.
Okay, let's go over here on that.
I was wondering, two questions. If you could comment on the noise profile you get from vertical axis with turbine. With the horizontal axis, when you get these high velocity blades going at maybe 10 per minute, swooshing past you. And the other question is, what are the prospects for scaling so you don't need 30 to 60 times more turbines for the same power output?
Okay, you're asking us John Berry questions.
Those are illegal.
No, seriously, unfortunately, We're not the ones to comment on the relative merits or the noise factor or any of that. We were interested, we took the facts, John's job was to answer all those questions and to make sure that the way we set things up was true to what he understood the facts to be. So unfortunately, John's not here today, so the questions that you're asking, which are perfectly valid, should be directed to the person who did that work, and that's not us, unfortunately. Yeah.
When in future surveys, are you having interest in doing one, looking at people putting canopies along with rooftops? So when a building and all the vehicles associated with it have enough solar to cover both the building and the vehicles, which may mean a lot of times it may mean putting solar canopies over parking driveways and stuff like that, which provides shade and has other benefits. Is that something you guys might do sometime?
We might. I mean, we focused on something which seemed to be a problem. And so, as we move to more devolved types of energy systems, I think there are going to be questions about what people's acceptance of that would be, and what they feel about the importance of having what the topic last week, what are people willing to pay to make sure that they have reliability or things like that. So yes, we could do more of that. We took this because it was a problem that we saw based on John's presentation.
Clean energy may be willing to try to subsidize a test of that.
Oh, well, okay.
well,
Come and talk to Iris.
Yes. Let us know. Yes.
Yeah.
Fabulous research, wonderful questions, very insightful way to look at it. I'm not sure that this comment would change the result, this question would change the result. It probably doesn't. If you look at the relative bird populations in China versus California, what was the difference?
Oh, no, we didn't.
We didn't look at that
This
part
is where I've been trying to push John to look at that. I mean, one of the reasons why I think Texas and Oklahoma have zoomed ahead, I mean, there are many reasons. There are differences in policy. But one of the important things is that they're not in the same wildlife plane for migration of the birds, and so they have that advantage. Plus, probably they're a little less concerned about it than Californians, and there aren't as many environmental groups. Basically, our belief is that there's a lot more to be done to sort of look at cross-state differences in some of these things. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, there, ma'am.
Following this was fascinating. This is fascinating. Did you take it further and develop the persuasive arguments based on the data to move, for instance, in this case, the vertical wind turbines ahead, or any of the issues ahead? So you can take the data and then develop the arguments to promote the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. That would be the purpose of this. What we were trying to get John to say is, look, the bird issue is your strongest point of view, your strongest argument to take to the regulators and to help you get your permitting done. And what you ought to do is a natural experiment to sort of see how many birds in an area that has horizontal and vertical, actually do a comparison of the amount of bird kills in a similar area so that you can actually bring facts to the permitting community. Because right now, I think a lot of this is not well documented, and that's the next stage before you go and make the argument, is to actually document it with some sort of scientific evidence.
Let's see, we're just, I'll take one more.
So this is like a general question about the research with China. So China is like racially fairly homogenous. Like in California, you account for like different demographics in the population. How did you necessarily do that for like urban centers in China?
Yeah, it's challenging. We actually have a commercial company who does polling in China to do our work. So they have a framework that is kind of like, mostly in the urban setting. They have a hard time getting respondents in the rural setting. So mostly like big cities, and then like you said, they are very homogeneous like when it comes to race, but then they're very heterogeneous when it comes to education. But then in our sample, like 60% of them have bachelor degree, So our sample is definitely way, more educated than your average, population in China. So that is, one kind of like, challenge that we have with doing public opinion study in China.
So I see we're now out of time. I'd like to thank Iris and Bruce for a very thought-provoking talk and the audience for excellent questions. Thank you very much.